Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with Trump saying that, quote, he's ready to go to war on Wednesday when the ceasefire expires, while the Iranian side says they have, quote, prepared new surprises for a potential new round of combat, as diplomatic efforts to have Vice President Vance meet with his Iranian counterparts in Pakistan falter. Joining us to discuss the farcical nature of U.S. diplomacy run by real estate grifters taking conflicting orders from a mentally ill megalomaniac is Jonathan Geyer, Program Director of the Institute for Global Affairs at the Eurasia Group. A reporter and editor focused on foreign policy, national security, and the Middle East. He is an Arabic and Hebrew speaker and spent 5 years as a correspondent in Egypt. And he's a regular contributor to the New Republic, New York Magazine, The Guardian, among others. And we'll discuss his article at the New York Times. For Kushner and Witkoff, CEO diplomacy is no longer working. Then, with Trump turning allies into enemies while weakening America at warp speed, we'll go to Toronto, Canada, to speak with Stephen Marche, a novelist and culture writer who has written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, The New Yorker, Esquire, and many other outlets. His recent books include The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future, and The Last Election, co-authored with Andrew Yang. Then finally we'll assess how long the ridiculous Trump fanboy in charge of the FBI, Kash Patel, will last after reports of serial drunkenness with his own security detail having to break down doors to wake him. Joining us is Scott Horton, a former lecturer at Columbia Law School and a contributing editor at Harper's in Legal Affairs and National Security. He serves on the American branch of the International Law Association and has represented a variety of journalists and whistleblowers. And he has a new Substack, the Horton Kaiser Report, with former New York Times and Wall Street Journal reporter Charles Kaiser. And before we begin, with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump kakistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part, delivering a daily public service, providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now, Jonathan Geyer, Program Director at the Institute for Global Affairs at the Eurasia Group, a reporter and editor focused on foreign policy, national security, and the Middle East. He is an Arabic and Hebrew speaker and spent 5 years as a correspondent in Egypt, and is a regular contributor at the New Republic, the New York Magazine, The Guardian, among others. And he has an article in the New York Times, for Kushner and Witkoff, CEO diplomacy is no longer working. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jonathan Geyer.
Thank you, Ian.
So here we have today Trump saying he's ready to go to war on Wednesday when the ceasefire expires. On the Iranian side, they're saying they're prepared for new surprises for a potential new round of combat. And the diplomatic efforts involving Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner seem to be all over the place. I don't know, was any point in talking about what the latest is, because it could change on a dime, right?
It's really hard to keep track of, and it's hard to make sense of who's up and who's down. And I keep coming back to this moment that I think was pretty revelatory last month, where you had Mr. Kushner speaking at a Saudi investment conference in Miami. And he says, I think peace is not that different than business. Now, this was in the middle of U.S. and Israeli bombs falling on Iran. It sure didn't seem like there was peace for just about anybody. And there's been a cascade of detrimental effects for people across the Middle East and Arab and countries in Israel, in Iran. I mean, there's absolutely no peace. But here you have the president's peacemakers acting as if it's just like another business deal. And it's very worrisome that the president is almost like a spaghetti on the wall moment that he keeps sending back the very same personal envoys that have gotten us into this mess.
So, is this all about the kakistocracy that we have running this country into the ground? In other words, in the land of the blind, the one eyed man is king, and Trump presides over this cabinet of sycophantic idiots. I mean, embarrassing, stupid people. And some of them are complete crackpots like RFK Jr., and they're very dangerous. And the other guy, now the FBI guy, we'll be talking about later in the program, is apparently a serial drunk. So I don't mean to make light of it because they're running this country. You know what?
Well, we've been talking about this, Ian, over the past year of this administration, and you kind of ripped me early on that I was a bit of an optimist because I did see the Trump factor as representing something different. He got a ceasefire when he came into office in January 2025. They deepened that Israel-Hamas Gaza ceasefire in October. And that was something that had eluded the Biden administration. And so I had initially, my assessment was, hey, the experts aren't always right. The experts gave us the Iraq War of 2003 that was so disastrous. And there was something novel and perhaps positive about someone like Mr. Kushner and Mr. Witkoff by bringing in that business approach because one hopes that, businessmen's bottom line mean that they really want peace. But I think at this moment, we see 6 months into the Gaza ceasefire, the aid that's gone into Gaza is totally insufficient. I think 800 or so Palestinians in Gaza have been killed since October. And then when it came to Iran, now Mr. Witkoff has negotiated twice with the Iranians, June or May and June 2025, and then in February of this year in the lead up to this current conflict and wasn't able to get a deal. So, in my humble estimation, these are not the envoys we want for this job. We need true diplomats with expertise and experience. The Obama deal did not come out of thin air. This came after years and years of very difficult back channel diplomacy with true experts on nuclear issues, true experts on Iran and Middle East policy. But still, I'm not going to be a naive optimist, but I do think having someone who bucks the conventions could be a positive thing. But I don't think Mr. Witkoff has lived up to that goal yet.
But Jonathan, when you talk about businessmen bringing fresh ideas, it's worth looking at their history as businessmen. I mean, first of all,
Exactly.
Kushner, the first thing he did when he was courting Ivanka was buy this building at 666 Fifth Avenue, paid overpriced to impress her. Then it was such a white elephant that it was about to bring the entire Kushner company down. And through his connections with Mohammed bin Salman, who was threatening a war on Qatar, Kushner was able to get the Qataris to bail him out. So that goes back to the first Trump presidency, where he was using his White House connections to further his business interest, in this case to save the family firm. Witkoff's background as a slumlord and a partner to Alen Blavatnik, who was one of Putin's oligarchs. He's not exactly a stellar record there. So I think that's worth looking at, isn't it? I mean, the quality of the... And then on top of that, you got Donald Trump himself, who's the boss. He's probably one of the worst businessmen in history.
Well, I think this is the point I was getting at in the New York Times piece is that if these were real businessmen, and look, there was a real fault in someone like Rex Tillerson, the ExxonMobil head who became Secretary of State, but there might be a certain kind of heft and gravitas they would bring. But this really feels like you say, like the president's family business. And with that comes, I think, a kind of bankruptcy of moral standing and so forth, and a kind of Mr. Kushner, I just went through his memoir, which is a fascinating case study of the first term. He touts this as a positive that Mohammed bin Salman and Arab leaders found it very familiar to interact with him because he is the president's son-in-law. He basically took over his family business and so forth. But that is not sufficient to bring about a deal. And I do think the elephant in the room as well is his deep connections with Prime Minister Netanyahu and the affinity towards the Israeli government's positions, and whether throughout Mr. Kushner and Mr. Witkoff just didn't want to have any uranium, any Iranian enrichment of nuclear, because that seems to be the sticking point and sort of undermines the entire premise of these negotiations, which, according to insiders, the negotiations in February with Iran could have led to a great deal. They could have led to something as robust, if not more so, than the Obama nuclear deal. But right now, we're in the worst possible situation, which is a destructive war that's affecting just about everybody.
Well, you mentioned Rex Tillerson, who was the CEO of ExxonMobil and was Trump's first Secretary of State. He referred to Trump as an effing moron. I mean, there are no Mattises and General Kelly, the first
Sure, the
chief of staff.
so-called adults in the room and HR McMaster and it's sort of a funny thing. I've always had questions about the adults in the room and who they really represented, but I think now we're seeing what happens when we don't have the kind of military senior official types or senior executive business folks in the administration. This is a very different character, Trump 2.0.
Right, but the fact that Trump is talking about something as bizarre as nuclear dust, that's just chronic. I mean, you've got to have somebody in that cabinet. The Executive Energy, of course, probably doesn't know any more than Trump does, given the cacistocracy. But we have no national security structure. And apparently, the so called adult, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, he's apparently, like J.D. Vance and everybody else, afraid of Trump. So they don't give him advice. They cower and take orders from him. That seems to be the situation. I
I
mean,
do worry about that. There does seem to be a real bubble around this president. Bloomberg News described it as a yes, sir cabinet and has this in-depth report saying that no one in the cabinet level wanted to dismiss the ridiculousness of launching a war on Iran. And just today, the president said to CNBC, he said, I would have won Vietnam very quickly if I were president, which seems to really sum up the fantasy of military solutions to political problems that we keep finding ourselves in.
so could it get worse? Could he use a nuke, for example, on Isfahan to get, to deep penetrate the ground where this nuclear dust, turn the nuclear dust into dust? I mean, I know it sounds extreme, but we're not dealing with rational, reasonable, and experienced people.
Well, it's absolutely troubling that that's even a conversation point here. I mean, I think the one heartening thing, Ian, was that Chinese and Pakistani diplomacy did create some kind of pause here. I think it's not enough to take us forward, but just the fact that there has been a diplomatic pause, the fact that JD Vance, the vice president, who, as many questions and criticisms one might have of him, is associated with less militaristic policy, is an elected official, has some experience in various realms that a Mr. Kushner or Mr. Witkoff doesn't have. I don't think we have clarity on his participation in these talks, but it would be nice to have a senior elected official engaging with the Iranians and finding a way forward because, as you say, this is an incredibly dangerous moment. I've heard people say it's the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's just not where we want to be, especially given it's a war of choice.
So, just in the last few minutes, then, Jonathan, um, since the clock is ticking on the ceasefire ending on Wednesday, and as far as we know, Vance is not in the air, at least when we're speaking here, and I'm not sure. The Iranians keep saying no, they're not going. And then on the other hand, Trump says, no, I'm not going to extend. We're ready. We're locked and loaded. We're ready to go. He says the military are raring to go. So that's where he's coming from. So it would seem to me that the best hope here is the taco Trump, that he chickens out on all his bluster and agrees to an extension of the ceasefire. What do you think is the likely outcome here?
I mean, diplomatic sources I've spoken to are very concerned about a return to war. And look, we can't forget that the first act of this war was an attack on a girls' school in Iran that killed 175 people, many of them students. So we can't lose sight of how destructive and dangerous these activities have been. On the other hand, I do think this is a moment for diplomats to really jump in, and who knows, there could be a role for regional powers. There could be a role for the UN Security Council. They've largely not played a big role here. So and of course, the regional effects are incredibly troubling with Israel occupying parts of Lebanon, with I believe 1.2 million Lebanese folks have been uprooted and displaced. And of course, the situation in Gaza is ever worse, and the attention is just not very much focused on that. So I don't know how we counterbalance all of this in the immediate term, but just extending that ceasefire uh, despite all the bluster and all the threats, should be a very urgent priority to everybody.
So let's broaden it out there to look at the damage already done and how difficult it will be to undo the damage, and perhaps the damage cannot be undone in terms of Trump turning friends and allies into enemies for whatever reasons. I don't know why he's gone after Canada, Greenland, NATO. The Asian allies, the Japanese and South Koreans, are furious over what Trump has done by cutting off their oil supplies and not appearing to care one bit. Australia's running out of jet fuel. The Europeans are running out of jet fuel. Everybody's being hurt. We could have a global recession, even a depression, inflicted on us by this erratic person who doesn't seem to care. And the expression in diplomacy is that if you want to be in on the landing, you have to be in on the takeoff. He just went ahead and did this in the Gulf without talking to the allies. And then he turns around and wants the allies to get him out of this mess. And they're furious and they're saying no. So this is what worries me, is that I don't think NATO really exists anymore. What do you think?
Well, that much seems clear. I do think, the only constraints that really exist on this president and this turn towards militarism that we've seen in the past year are going to be domestic. They're going to come in the form of the midterms, elections that are coming up. They're going to come in the form of whether protests could galvanize a new peace movement that takes on this president. Of course, protests against policies on Gaza were severely constricted at universities by law enforcement. There have been protests in recent years, but it's been very difficult. And then, of course, the Senate and lawmakers who, in theory, are the only ones who can declare war. But in practice, we haven't seen Congress take on its role as its constitutionally mandated role in war powers. So I think it's going to have to come from the US, from all of US elected officials, from people power, and from these upcoming elections. But until then, we're just going to have to hope that some of the voices in the Trump administration, some of those who have, like Joe Kent, resigned in protest of this war, or some of those who have advocated for diplomacy on the inside and presumably stayed in, take on a bigger role, because as it stands, as you say, Ian, it's an incredibly dangerous moment, and it's very, very liable to get much worse.
But I think the press and our politicians, both on the Republican and the Democratic side, are not serving us by not dealing with the reality of who Trump is and the kakistocracy surrounding him. I mean, these people really don't know what they're doing. The evidence is overwhelming. I think we've got to stop treating this guy like a normal president. We've got to really take the 25th Amendment seriously. I don't see any other alternative. And I don't see J.D. Vance arguing for the 25th Amendment or the kakistocracy of a cabinet, the sycophants. They're not going to. They're required in terms of the 25th Amendment, along with two-thirds of the House and Senate. So don't you think that the debate has to get real? We just have to stop treating this guy like a president and recognize that he's a dangerously mentally ill person with his finger on the nuclear button.
Well, I think you're getting at something, and on the one hand, it's the procedural, that there are ways in which lawmakers can hold a executive branch leader to account. And for example, to bring it back to Mr. Kushner, he doesn't have a formal role We don't know about his financial entanglements. We don't have a sense of his income or the exact contours of his golf investments and so forth. So there's the kind of procedural level that I think is very important here. And it's not just going as far as the 25th Amendment, but there's a lot of other ways that lawmakers could hold this president to account as he undertakes wars that seem very unlawful and have what many have reported to be war crimes and so forth. But I think the other thing perhaps you're getting at, Ian, is the kind of moral outrage and the kind of moral obligation of being a leader. And I feel like morality and foreign policy are not coming into contact so much anymore. We don't have moral conversations enough about what the role the US has to be in the world. And it's not just enough to criticize the actions of the president. I think the opposition party, the Democrats in this case, have to offer up some other form of leadership. And I think many Americans are just desperately waiting around to hear what they would do. And until that message is delivered, it's very hard to mobilize around something that's just a negative and a critique of this president, even if it has all of, as you lay out, tendencies of warmongering that put all of us at risk.
Well, Jonathan Guy, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Jonathan Guy, who's a program director at the Institute for Global Affairs at the Eurasia Group and a reporter and editor focused on foreign policy, national security, and the Middle East. He's an Arabic and Hebrew speaker and spent 5 years as a correspondent in Egypt and is a regular contributor at The New Republic, New York Magazine, The Guardian, among others. And he has an article at the New York Times for Kushner and Witkoff, CEO diplomacy is no longer working. We're going to take a brief station break back looking into how Trump is turning allies into enemies while weakening America at warp speed.
A long, long time ago. Who knows? Not me. We never lost control. Your face to face with the man who sold the world.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Stephen Marche, a novelist and culture writer who has written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, The New Yorker, Esquire, and many other outlets. His recent books include The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future, and The Last Election, co-authored with Andrew Yang. Welcome to Background Briefing, Stephen Marche.
Ian, how are you?
Well, I got a bit of a cold, but otherwise, you're up there in Canada, and your Prime Minister made a pretty extraordinary 10-minute video, which I think has shaken up. It's sort of gone viral, has it not? And not so long ago, Trump, in his usual blustering, bullying way, said that Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. Well, Mark has come back with one hell of a statement, don't you think?
Well, I mean, I think it's gone viral in the States, but for us, this is pretty normal. I mean, even a few weeks ago, he gave a very similar speech at the Liberal caucus meeting, which is not a major news item even in Canada, but he gave a very similar speech there. And of course, he just won 3 by-elections, which means that Canada now has a majority government. And so he can sort of, I mean, I think the coincidence of the video is that he's not a minority government prime minister anymore. He's a majority government prime minister, and he can sort of speak for the country and for his government in a way that he couldn't before. But yeah, I mean, what he's saying is what he's been saying for an awfully long time now.
But it seems like he's also speaking for the world, because so much of our allies, not that Trump cares about allies, but they are so angry, the South Koreans, the Japanese, about what Trump has done with Iran and closing off the Straits of Hormuz. The Europeans are furious. Australia's running out of jet fuel.
Yeah.
And he didn't consult anybody. It's an old expression in foreign policy. If you want to be in on the landing, you got to be in on the takeoff. Well,
right.
This high-handed idiot who doesn't know what he's doing just plunges the whole world into a disastrous situation. And given his desperation to get out of this mess that he created for himself, he's likely to make the worst deal in the world, and we'll end up with an unstable, already, dangerously unstable region being perhaps even on fire. So it seems to be that Mark Carney is not just speaking for Canada, he's speaking for the rest of the world that has always been united with the United States and is now just can't believe what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think Canada is first to understand what's happened in America because we're just so much closer. I mean, like there's a reason why I wrote the next Civil War and not some European writer or even an American writer, right? It's because we're sort of very close to the United States. We all have family there. I've worked there. Like it's all. It was a very, very intimate relationship, and so the breaking came sort of first for us. But I think the anger, like I think that's for Canada anyway, that's about a year old. Like because the anger at Trump is, equally as pointless as, like agreeing with Trump. Like you get nothing out of it. The question is, what do we build next? And and this is where it starts to actually become a little more hopeful because when you start to look at like, well, what can we do in the world without the United States? A lot of things become possible, and America is endangering itself first. It's obviously a danger to the world, but it also gets weaker, every couple of days, really. And so the questions that Carney is bringing, and the reason that he possibly is a global leader in a way that no Canadian prime minister has ever been, is that we're starting to understand now, like, well, this has all been a complete fiasco. But at the other end of this, there is a new world to be built, and we can probably build it. Like it's not beyond the possibilities of the rest of the world to build a meaningful rules-based order just without the United States as part of it.
Well, what Carney said in the video was that got a lot of people's attention is, quote, many of our former strengths based on close ties to America have become weaknesses, weaknesses we must correct. And then he went on to say that we have to take care of ourselves because we can't rely on one foreign partner. We can't control the disruption coming from our neighbors. We can't control our future on the hope it will suddenly stop. We can control what happens here. We can build a stronger country that can withstand disruptions from abroad. And then he went on to say, simply hoping that the United States will return to normal was not a feasible strategy. Hope isn't a plan, and nostalgia is not a strategy. So,
yeah, I mean, to me, that was very much an internal comment for the consumption of the Canadian elites. Like, I mean, to me, what that was, there are still people in the military here, people in businesses, people in very senior levels of leadership who are just basically hoping that America comes to its senses and that we go back to the way things were, which was a very sweet position for us. We had access to this huge market, and we didn't really have to worry about defense. That was taken care of, or even national security questions. Like that was all taken care of in another place. And so when he says it's not coming back, what he's really saying is if you're not on board with major changes to our economic and cultural and military and security sectors and you're in power, get out. That to me was the point of that message. Like I think that really was for internal consumption. Although it is very interesting how the world has taken that as new information, because that's been the mainstream of political understanding in this country for at least a year.
well, apparently the NATO leaders have already figured this out some time back. They've totally given up on Trump. They assume that Article 5 will not ever be invoked by the United States. And
No,
we're still...
or it'll be subject to some random political nonsense in the United States, which is not a stable or it's not a country that has a great history of keeping its promises, right? I mean, but also I think Ukraine is doing better now that America has got out of its way, right? Like the question of like whether in the United States was actually leaking information to Russia is actually really clear. And then of course you have the Iran situation where it's like, Well, America just lost a war in record time, right? Like this is not a, is this a superpower anymore? Like, a superpower is as a superpower does. And this is not what a superpower looks like, where it like loses a war within 6 weeks to a vastly lesser, adversary, right? And so these questions now become, well, what do we do? Like, what do we, now that we're like the despair part and the horror part is all gone? Now the question is, well, what are we actually building? And what Carney was saying is, we like do not lose the understanding that we need to start building, because it's not going back to the way it was.
So, what can Canada do in terms of reorientating its trading and business and economic relations? For example, they're talking
Oh,
about.
well, it's a huge. I mean, there's we're in a tumult of ideas over here. I mean, like, we are exploring a lot of, like, one of the really interesting questions that we're focusing on is, like, why has Australia done so much better than us over the past 20 years? Like, why, like, maybe free trade with the United States was not the boon we always thought it would be, because because it has not actually, it has sort of kept moribund industries alive, and kept us from the potential that we had. And so, like, I think everything's on the table, multilateralism of all kinds. I think there's very different words for this, variable geometries. Like, we're going to make deals with a lot of people who share our values and a lot of people who don't share our values, and we're going to try and get to a balanced position where where our sovereignty is really not in question. And I mean, the military question is already, there's already, what seem very small changes from the outside. But, the fact that civil service now need to take, or groups of them now need to take, military training to basically provide a home resistance army in case of an invasion, like, that's already happened. So there are dramatic changes that have already been made. They're small, but they're building. And I think we are in the middle of really changing what we are as a country. Like, we're in the middle of it.
Right, but is Canada preparing to repel an American invasion?
Well, obviously that's something that we have to think about. I mean, it would be the ultimate asymmetrical conflict. Like, it's not, and of course, there's no appetite for it in America. It's only about 4% of the population actually want that. So, I think one thing we are very clearly doing is decoupling from U.S. military infrastructure, right? Like, we're going to, like, as Carney said in his Liberal caucus speech, like, the days of every 70 cents of Canadian defense spending going to the U.S. are over, right? Like, we're in a debate whether we're going to buy submarines from Korea or Sweden, but it's going to be one of them. It's not going to be from an American supplier, because the president made it very clear that any weapon that was sold to us would be second rate in case they wanted to take us over. I mean, you can't really buy from people who say these things to you, right? So, I think what we're really preparing for genuinely is just an America that's chaotic and collapsing, right? Which is like, I think an American invasion at this point is still very much unrealistic, and not. That's an extreme possibility of the future. But in America that's chaotic and totally unpredictable, in which you can't really make trade deals with because they don't keep trade agreements, that's a mainstream future possibility that we have to prepare for.
Well, it's America that's weakening itself. And that's what's so extraordinary, because allies in military parlance are force multipliers. And the idea that you're just giving a backhand to your allies, you've alienated the Europeans, the Australians, the South Koreans, the Japanese, and the Canadians.
Yeah.
For what? And you've got NORAD, which is, if any missiles come from Russia, they come over Canada. So it makes sense to have a relationship with Canada. And that's what NORAD has been, right?
Well, I mean, I think the question of what America is doing to itself now, every country in the world has been trying to get to the position that America is in, right? Lots of allies. The biggest beneficiary by far of global trade has been the United States. They wrote the rules, right? And it favored them in every way. and then its university systems, which were the envy of the world, right? Like the research capacities, which are very integrated into the national security apparatus, were the envy of the world. Plus the alliance structure, you've damaged all of them in a year for basically to make this old man feel big about himself, right? Like, and for his voters to feel big about himself, because he doesn't like that professors think they're smart, and he doesn't like that generals try to believe in rules of engagement and stuff like that. Why America decided to destroy its own power is actually one of those mysteries that I think will be discussed for centuries. Like I think Abraham Lincoln said, no enemy will ever be able to destroy us. I'm summarizing, but we'll either die by suicide or live for all time. Well, America's in the middle of a national suicide, right? Like they are in the middle of destroying the basis of their own power, all under the banner of "Make America Great Again." I mean, it's certainly nothing like I did not predict it in the next Civil War that there would be this deliberate weakening of the American political structure, but it's that is what it is, and it's extraordinary and horrible and terrible to witness.
Well, but it's so crazy that it leads you to wonder whether or not Trump is working for Putin. I mean, I know that sounds like a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
But certainly the relationship between Trump and Putin is pretty bizarre. And he defers to...
There's a theory here called Occam's kazoo. Have you heard of that?
Go ahead.
I wonder if it hasn't made its way down there, but it's it's in the papers all the time here, which is like Occam's razor, which is
Right.
the simplest answer is always the best one, which is the ultimate reason why conspiracy theories tend to be wrong. Like Occam's kazoo is that Donald Trump will intentionally do the stupidest, most ridiculous thing given any series of circumstances, right? Because of his malignant narcissism and because of he has no impulse control, basically. And I think there's a genuine question of his mental well-being at this point, like whether he is mentally healthy. The Article 25 was written for this moment in American history. So I don't really believe in conspiracy theories, but Occam's kazoo, i.e., like this is a man who is overwhelmed by his own failings as a human being, and that he's taking the country down with him with those failings. That seems to me a very powerful explanatory mechanism.
So just in closing then, Stephen, do you think that the rest of the world, the allies, the NATO countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, they're going to start trading more with China and amongst themselves and leave the US out in the cold? I mean, already I understand China's going to be allowing in Chinese electric cars, which apparently are cheap and fairly,
we're buying. I mean, too much is made of that deal. I mean, it was a simple trade. Like it was. We're allowing in like I think it's 49,000 Chinese EVs into the country, and they're opening up their canola markets, and I mean, it was very very far from a free trade agreement, like which everyone seems to think. It was more of a ad hoc arrangement about certain products. But at the same time, yeah, we're going to be. Well, the idea that if there was a time before during Biden and before where the idea was our trade networks would be built around values and we would orchestrate the values that we have around these trade networks. Well, America has blown that up, right? America has said there is no values-based trade network. As such, and also incidentally, there's no values-based military alliance network. There's just you do what we say, or we'll hurt you, or we want Greenland, you have to give it to us. Like this is the way the world is going to go. So, I mean, I think we're trying to deal with that new world and figure out ways to survive in it because we're not a big country, right? We're 40 million people. We've got to maintain our sovereignty by our own wits, and it's going to require very serious realpolitik on the level of Finland, on the level of Lithuania, Estonia. Like we have to start thinking like those countries now. Like, what does it take to survive?
Well, Stephen Marche, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure, Ian.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And again, I've been speaking with Stephen Marche, who's a novelist and culture writer who has written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, The New Yorker, Esquire, and many other outlets. His recent books include The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future, and The Last Election, co-authored with Andrew Yang, and he joined us from Toronto, Canada. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back with an assessment of how long the ridiculous Trump fanboy in charge of the FBI, Kash Patel, will last after reports of serial drunkenness, with his own security detail having to break down doors to wake him. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Scott Horton, former lecturer at Columbia Law School and a contributing editor at Harper's in Legal Affairs and National Security. He serves on the American branch of the International Law Association and has represented a variety of journalists and whistleblowers. And he has a new Substack, the Horton Kaiser Report, with former New York Times and Wall Street Journal reporter Charles Kaiser. Welcome to Background Briefing, Scott Horton.
Great to be with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Scott. And you've represented a lot of whistleblowers, particularly FBI agents. I've spoken to some that you've represented. And what's the word amongst them about this? I think everybody knew that Kash Patel was a part of the kakistocracy. And frankly, you have to blame Trump for the terrible people that he's put in government. The worst of all probably is RFK Jr., but this guy, Kash Patel, is just a joke. So what are you hearing from FBI agents about this? And do they think that there's a chance that Trump will fire him?
I think first of all, I would just say no one is surprised by this or any of these developments or the things that are reported in Sarah Fitzpatrick's piece in the Atlantic. I think some people have heard stories about the same things. I couldn't find anyone who had actually experienced anything described there, but of course, that would mostly be Kash's own security detail. I'd say that Kash, the two senior nominations that Trump made at the FBI, both Kash and then Dan Bongino, they were surprising and disappointing to the career FBI people because the FBI people prefer candidates for these positions who have their same background. That is, who either were with the Bureau over time or worked as federal prosecutors over long periods of time with the Bureau. And in fact, that describes almost every FBI director who's ever been appointed, from J. Edgar Hoover down to the present day. They're all these sorts of career federal prosecutors, investigators. So Kash Patel is totally outside that mold. And I'd say, most of the assessment of him was pretty simple. That is, he was not viewed as a serious person. And certainly not a person with depth or background in either of the two major areas of play for the FBI, which are criminal investigatory work and counterintelligence. And I did hear repeatedly over the course of the last 3 years, basically, that Kash Patel had shown up on the viewing screen of FBI counterintelligence people. And that is largely because I think they had the suspicion or concern that he was being targeted, both as he was a private citizen at that time, not a government worker, but he was being targeted both by the Russian intelligence services and by the Chinese. And this has a lot to do with the money he took from Igor Lopatonok, a so-called film producer who's, I think, widely suspected of having close ties with the Russian intelligence services. and Cash took a $25,000 retainer for him for who knows what. And also the work he did for a number of Chinese companies that had connections with the People's Liberation Army and with the Chinese intelligence services. That was seen as a sort of flashing yellow light. Not that Cash had been recruited by them per se, but that he was quite reckless in his associations, and that these people would use their connections with him to gain access to his communications devices, social media accounts, communication systems, and so forth. And of course, shortly after he became director, that turned out exactly to be the case. The Chinese were successful in penetrating Kash Patel's communications accounts and gaining access to all sorts of highly confidential information through that means. That's something I think is unprecedented and also extremely disturbing. So I'd say the overall reaction was we're not in the least bit surprised, and maybe this will provide the impotence for him to be replaced. I think it's quite clear that the majority of the FBI rank and file would like to see a professional prosecutor / criminal investigator in the senior roles at the Bureau.
Well, maybe Patel was chosen by Trump because of his sympathies or ties or whatever you want to say vis-a-vis the Russians, because if you go back to when Patel worked for Devin Nunes on the House Intelligence Committee in Trump's first term, he did everything he could to cover up Trump's ties to the Russians. And as soon as he gets in there, the first target is klepto capture, which is the operation the FBI had to go after the oligarchs, the Russian oligarchs, and Trump then Putin uses the oligarchs. He weaponizes money, which he washes through them, and they do his bidding. And he's absolutely eviscerated counterintelligence. All the top counterintelligence people in the FBI have been fired. And even recently, he fired the whole team that was looking at the Iranian terrorists who, they have no... They're absolutely aggressive when it comes to killing people on foreign soil. So just before the Iran war, he fires them all. So the FBI has become not a law enforcement agency, but an agency of retribution and an adjunct of ICE. I mean, they're all being transferred into rounding up immigrants. I mean, that's absolutely a waste of the 38,000 people that are supposed to fight crime, not go after Trump's enemies.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the ranks of the counterintelligence service at the Bureau have been decimated. And I'd say within those ranks, it's particularly Russian counterintelligence, Chinese counterintelligence, and Iranian counterintelligence, arguably the three most important prongs that have been all but entirely wiped out under a number of different pretexts. But, I think in many cases, it's hard to work in Russian counterintelligence and not be drawn, having been drawn at some point into an investigation that touched on Trump personally, members of his family, or members of his entourage, and pretty much all those people were either fired outright or told it's time for you to be leaving. So, I mean, to the extent there's some left, they're mostly out there looking for new places of employment right now. And of course, the FBI is counterintelligence. It is domestic counterintelligence for the United States. That role is not played by the CIA, and the role of the other intelligence agencies is far more modest. Much more on the back end, and signals intelligence and things of that sort.
Well, he's obviously a joke and an embarrassment, and he has been for day one. And he he auditioned for the job by writing these ridiculous children's books. What a great king Trump is, and mean Queen Hillary. And I mean, it's unbelievable. This guy's a complete fanboy and a Trump worshiper, and one of the leading cult figures, I guess, in the Trump cult. But I think why he drinks so much is because he's so damn insecure. He's so out of his depth. Isn't that a sort of, I don't want to get into cheap psychiatrics, but it seems to me that everything about this guy is about he should never be there. He doesn't know what he's doing. and he numbs himself with alcohol, and hangs out with some girlfriend who seems like a beard to me.
Right. Well, I mean, I have certainly no knowledge specifically about his drinking, but I do know, I mean, I have spoken in the past with people who've worked with Akash Patel and various jobs he had when he was coming up the ranks. And, they all consistently describe his persona as being very unserious and very much like a college fraternity boy who was really interested in partying and vacations and skiing and surfing and things like this. Much more of that than actually doing his work at any point. And, I guess I've heard those stories all along. And of course, one of the big problems that the FBI had with his appointment to start with, as I recall, was that people who made arrangements for his briefings and office support and everything were told very early on that no, he wasn't going to live in Washington, D.C. He enjoyed life in Las Vegas and he intended to continue to live in Las Vegas. And he's been doing that ever since he was appointed as director. I would say commuting back and forth to Washington, but living for fairly long stretches in Las Vegas, where he stays in a very posh, luxurious residence that doesn't belong to him, belongs to a GOP mega donor named Michael J. Muldoon, who is in fact a sort of timeshare shark who in the past was the target of investigations by the FBI. So that's also a rather odd thing. And that presented all sorts of difficulties for briefings, communications, the need to have a skiff, and all sorts of things of that sort. And he was just totally indifferent to that. So I think that sort of shows his interest being having fun and not actually doing work. And when you look at the work he does, the sloppiness is sort of the signature of it. I mean, he's routinely posting things on social media that A, shouldn't be posted because they're about ongoing investigations, and B, turn out to be false. He seems to have, like Dan Bongino, more of an interest in appealing to his podcast audience than doing the sort of sensitive work that FBI agents and the Bureau at high levels has historically had to do. So he is a different sort of FBI director from anything we've seen before.
Well, the article in the Atlantic is pretty devastating about him drinking himself into a stupor at the private club Ned's in Washington, D.C., and in Las Vegas at the Poodle Room. But I think, and more recently, of course, we all saw him on video, downing the beer and beating his chest with the Olympic hockey team. And apparently that did not play well with Trump, who doesn't drink and whose brother died from alcoholism. Apparently he called Patel after that video surfaced of him celebrating with the Olympic hockey team. So it seems like he may be on the skids here. I tell you, though, the people that I really resent in these stories about Patel and all these other clowns, like Tulsi Gabbard, and worst of all, RFK Jr., he's really doing a lot of serious damage. But the Republicans voted these people in, didn't they?
And that's right. Yes, I understand. The Senate Judiciary Committee, when the Patel nomination came up, they were given a briefing of all the issues that had been upturned by the FBI surrounding Kash Patel, and their reaction was one of just total indifference. And I'm thinking, like, this would, in any prior administration, would have absolutely sunk a nomination. But in this case, they didn't want to hear anything about it. That was sort of the absence of seriousness about the vetting process is really quite amazing here.
Right. Well, the Senate Judiciary Committee Chair, Chuck Grassley, said at the time of the Patel confirmation that, quote, he's the right change agents for the FBI and the Bureau needs a big shakeup. Well, that much he got right. I mean, Are they just afraid of Trump, these guys? Because at what point are they going to do the job, which is what the separation of powers is about?
I think that's right. So I think it's very, very clear. I mean, Patel is one of the nominees who makes it clearest that there's only one criterion in Trump's selection for these key jobs, and that is absolute, unquestioned personal fidelity and loyalty, and willingness to execute Trump's commands, whatever they are, no matter how illegal or unconstitutional. And I think, this is the area where Patel comes through in spades right now. And I would say this is what I would expect from the current flap surrounding the Atlantic magazine, is that he's had an operation running for some time now to bring criminal cases and prosecute people based on 2020 election fraud. So I would expect that Kash Patel is going to accelerate this and push forward with it as a means of demonstrating to Trump that he's reliable and can be counted upon to do what Trump wants him to do. I'm pretty sure. And if you look at the orchestrated response he's had since the Atlantic article broke, it's really a response that plays to an audience of one, and that is Trump. So this sort of tough guy reaction, coupled with a libel lawsuit seeking astronomical damages, that's a very Trump-style response. And in this case, brought by a lawyer named Jesse Binnall, who is quite famous for bringing libel suits on behalf of prominent Republicans. He did it for General Michael Flynn, for Mark Robinson, the failed Republican gubernatorial candidate in North Carolina. He did it for Devin Nunes and for several others. And the thing that unites all of those libel suits that Binnall has brought is that they all fail. I mean, not only they all fail, they were all quite ridiculous. So Binnall brings suits that are drafted basically as press releases, not really as legal pleadings. And he does that because there is what's called a pleading privilege. You can say whatever you want in the pleading, and it's not libelous. So, of course, he does that in spades, and he's smearing in the Atlantic in his libel suit.
Well, just in closing, on Sunday, Patel announced on the Fox Business show with Maria Bartiromo that we're going to make arrests, and it's coming, and I promise you it's coming soon. He's talking about prosecuting people over the 2020 election. So that's their next stupid, diversion from the fact that the premier law enforcement agency in this country has been crippled by this clown. I thank you for joining us. Appreciate it, Scott.
All the best, yes.
And again, I've been speaking with Scott Horton, who's a former lecturer at Columbia Law School and a contributing editor at Harper's in Legal Affairs and National Security. He serves on the American branch of the International Law Association and has represented a variety of journalists and whistleblowers. And he has a new Substack, the Horton Kaiser Report, with former New York Times and Wall Street Journal reporter Charles Kaiser. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon and Asher Price. And if you've missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can visit us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we'll include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easy for you to sign up for the daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. And you can find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media managers, Evan and Luke Susswood, are also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help us sustain this program into the future and assure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
Disappeared by 9:30. Who'll ever know how much she loved them so? That dark night alone in America. more